Welcome to the Defense Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington, D.C., and we have with us Steve Grundman, former Pentagon Industrial Affairs Chief, who is the George and M.A. Lund Fellow here. You look at future technologies, but also monitor the industrial base. Steve, President-elect has made some defense industrial news right from his Twitter account. First was last week when he criticized Air Force One, obviously an important Boeing contract, said that it was out of control. That came shortly after Dennis Muhlenberg, the CEO of Boeing, had discussed the importance of free trade. Right. Obviously, Boeing, the most important contributor to the balance of payments, balance of trade in the United States. Full disclosure, Boeing is one of our sponsors. This week was a tweet specifically taking on the F-35 program, obviously very important to Lockheed Martin.
And many others.
And many others, but obviously the prime contractor of that. The stock price of both of these companies took a hit. Talk to us a little bit about whether, there were some folks who are very concerned about this. There are others who are less concerned about it. Where do you fall on this? This sort of policy through Twitter that has a very meaningful impact on the stock price of giant companies on which the Pentagon and the government depend.
I don't think it is a reflection of a strategy. I don't think it's a defense industrial policy. I don't think it's an acquisition policy. I don't think it's a defense policy. I also think the two instances have different impeti. So the first instance you mentioned, the retort to
or seeming retort, or that's how people perceive it.
Well, no, I do. I think, and I was going to say, I think that was a don't mess with me, Mr. CEO. But the subsequent one, I actually interpret more, and they may have learned this off of the reverberations from the first one, the beginning of a campaign to make deficit spending great again. Certainly one of the things that I took away from the Reagan National Defense Forum that was very well covered by the Defense and Aerospace Report.
Thank you very much for the shout out.
You're welcome. Was that raising the defense budget by anything like the magnitude, even smaller magnitudes than the President-elect has indicated, it's going to be really hard. And I think as that made its way back into the transition team, I think they realized that they're going to have to start a popular campaign to make deficit spending great again. And while I hope, and I don't think the President-elect is trying to vilify the defense industry as part of the groundwork for that, I think giving the back of the hand to the defense industry is designed to create a culture of acceptance for raising defense spending, which I think is going to require more deficit spending than the country has become accustomed to believing is tolerable.
Well, we're already at the $20 trillion mark, or almost near, which is the debt limit. Obviously, Congress will have to extend it. Senator Graham talked eloquently about the challenges of that don't be in an in-the-money mode, and that's very much where Wall Street has been with this, right? Thinking that the gravy train, as it will, of ever-increasing dividends, buybacks will continue on a rising defense budget. Could Wall Street be in for a little bit of a surprise here where expectations may not match reality?
Well, as you know, we're off a conversation this morning that I hosted here at the Atlantic Council where we discussed this and a range of other things. And I thought the metaphor, though it's even quite literal, that this is going to be a high beta administration was one of the nice bites off of that conversation. And I think it's one that, for all we know, Wall Street recognizes, right? Because there's two edges to a high beta investment, and one of them is upside, but the other one is potentially sharp downside. And so I think that's what we're going to be in, and for a while. The other implication I would draw off of this metaphor, a high beta administration, or maybe even a high beta defense industrial policy, is there will be a sharper gradient to winning and losing. There will be some big winners, but there also will be some big losers in the way the new administration comes to town. Generates a campaign for a bigger defense budget, and then actually applies it.
You were in the position of being the defense industrial policy guy, the defense industrial affairs guy at the Pentagon. That was a challenging time, obviously, as the consolidation trend was going on. Obviously, the controversial breakup of the hoped-for merger of Lockheed and Northrop happened then at that time as well. But one of the questions that I have for you is, what's the advice you have for this team coming in? I mean, the Obama administration became reviled by CEOs for, war on profits. The better buying power initiatives were criticized. All of that said, the companies did very, very well on a stock price basis. What are What do you think is the defense industrial legacy of this administration, but what does the next administration have to bear in mind as it makes its defense industrial plans? Because there are some folks who are mentioned for some of these jobs that are very, very qualified guys to come in at an acquisition level, into the department.
I think to take the first question, the legacy, the defense industrial legacy of this administration, I think is rich and from my point of view, admirable. But to put it in a nutshell, I think it is to have grasped the lever of competition, the lever of value creation called competition, and to believe, and I think with substantial reasons, that has by and large been successful. So the defense industry is a more hotly contested marketplace in most of the segments where companies compete now than it was before. And once again, that has two edges. On the one side, maybe in the short term, that has helped contain cost. It certainly has given companies that are good at that, at either contending with or presenting themselves as competition, opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have had. But at the same time, right, there's a rough edge to using competition as the lever of value creation. Anyway, I think that's the legacy of the new administration that's leaving office. For the next administration, again, I'll reflect a little bit off the conversation we had this morning. I do think we are at that proverbial inflection point where restructuring, more fundamental restructuring of the defense industry of the sort that we saw in the middle 90s is probably in the offing. What the recipe for value creative restructuring of individual companies or combinations of companies might be is hard to say because there are a lot of cross currents both in industrial policy and in the corporate and capital markets that don't make it obvious exactly what the winning recipe for corporate restructuring is, the way it did become by about 1995, what that winning recipe was going to be for that round. It's going to take a couple years for that to play out, but I think it will play out within the 4 years of this administration.
And do you think that as some have suggested, I wasn't going to violate anything that involved Chatham House rule. You haven't. I wasn't even going to raise it, but thank you very much for your. You were the host of the event, and it was a fascinating discussion this morning. Do you think, as you look at it, the new administration, there is a perception that it's going to be about more things, just buy more stuff, and that the innovation initiatives that have been one of the hallmarks of this administration, the Obama administration, are going to fall by the wayside. Do you think that's going to be the case, or do you think that reform is going to press ahead, just like the innovation, the Silicon Valley outreach, and a couple of these other initiatives, third offset even for that matter, will continue into the new administration?
I think it will depend on where the new administration, again, once they all get into office, where they place in time the problem that they're working on, if I can put it to you that way. Is the problem that they are primarily going to try and solve a really near-term problem? In which case, I do think the sort of investments that Ash Carter and Frank Kendall and not least Bob Work associate with the Defense Innovation Initiative and the third offset will recede. If, on the other hand, and I think both possibilities are almost equally feasible, given what we know of the administration, if they place the point of emphasis, the optimal point in time of the defense policy problem they're trying to solve farther out into the future, the way I think most eloquently Frank Kendall talks about it, then I think there's no you can call it something different. You can it can have some different composition, but the need to reinvest in innovation to gain a competitive advantage against near-peer competitors 10, 15, 20 years from now will be the game. And this administration will, again, albeit perhaps with different nomenclature, they will embrace that strategic investment as this administration has. However, I return to the first point, which is it's not clear to me, even thinking about General Mattis, kind of where the balance of their priorities are going to lie. Short, near term, midterm, long term, that's what will tell as to whether the Defense Innovation Initiative or something like it will carry over.
One last question. Obviously, defense and trade are intermingled. Canada is a very close trading partner. It's a defense partner. If you look at it, countries around the world, not just treaty allies, the United States has very successful trade pacts, and open and free trade has been a hallmark of numerous American administrations, and that looks like it's changing. Does the scrapping of TPP and the replacement of a Chinese-led economic forum over in the Pacific, as well as the dissolution of NAFTA, and some folks are looking at it from a European perspective, also some challenges there. Do you think that ultimately that may have a defense industrial implication as countries perhaps look away from the United States, even though they are some of our closest allies?
I don't know if trade policy per se, it certainly has some relationship to the defense industrial base. Per se, I don't think it does. However, it is part of an atmosphere that will accelerate or enhance an existing trend toward partners wanting to, particularly the developing world partners and the second world partners, wanting to bring into their own countries the indigenous capabilities that we associate with defense industry. So I think it is part of a context that will accelerate this existing trend of, for example, in Saudi Arabia, moving more and more of the actual industrial capability that the Saudis have heretofore relied on the West to provide, making an indigenous capability. Absent a hostility toward trade and toward globalization, you could see a retardation potentially of that. Particularly if the Americans approach these nations and with a different idea. But I think it's part of a larger context that's going to simply accelerate that trend.
Security posture also matters. Do you think, for example, some folks have said that if the administration gets closer to Russia to better fight ISIS at the expense of Europe, that could have a potential repercussion. Same thing in Asia. In negotiating a trade deal, do folks feel like we've distanced on a security basis? Is that something that everybody's got to be very watchful on in terms of messaging?
Look, if the United States is no longer the partner of choice to solve the great security problems of the Western world, then absolutely, it'll have implications both in respect to military-to-military cooperation, alliances, and, yes, defense-industrial cooperation, for sure.
Steve, thanks very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you.